On this channel, we cover a lot of different electric vehicles that are coming to market. Unfortunately, a lot of them, increasingly so in fact, are large, expensive crossovers and SUVs with the occasional pickup truck thrown in for good measure. But as anyone who's watched this channel for any length of time will tell you, in order for the world to decarbonize both its energy and its transportation, we need a whole range of different options. We need sustainable grids. We need renewable energy. We need microgrid technology. We need community solar projects. We need micromobility for people to get that last mile as they're traveling around town. We need electric cars in a range of different price points. And of course, we need more low carbon and zero carbon mass transit. And that's why I'm here today, because I am at the Forth Mobility Conference here in Portland, Oregon. It's been held for as long as I have lived in the US, and it grows every year. And I'm really glad to be here today talking to Jeff Allen, who's the Executive Director of Forth. He's been at Forth since 2011, and the last time we spoke was way back in 2016 when Forth was opening its first mobility showcase in downtown Portland. Things have changed a lot. There have been car club programs, car share programs, both in town and rural. There's been a whole load of new funding been made available by the US federal government. And so we're going to chat about all of that good stuff and what's next for Forth. Jeff, it is great to see you again. The last time we talked on camera was when Forth opened its first showroom in downtown Portland. Showroom designed to encourage people to dump the pump and go electric. It's now many years later.
Yes.
Forth is now in multiple states and doing a huge number of different projects, not just around electric vehicles, but sustainable mobility, micromobility, and community development programs. Where do we start?
That's a great question. I was just thinking, so that's been like 7 years, I think. Well, not that much has happened in electric transportation, really. We could probably cover this in a couple of minutes. I think what's amazing is what hasn't changed, right? 2023, and still something like 80% of Americans have never been in an electric car, have never driven an electric car. So it's easy to forget in our little Portland bubble here that we still have all that work to do in most of the country, most of the world. You know, not to pick on y'all, but I just saw my favorite survey again that said something like 40% of Brits are afraid they'll be electrocuted if they take their electric car through a car wash. We have those things continuing to pop up here. What was the other one I just saw? That parking garages are going to collapse?
Yeah, that was a thing out of New York. We're actually making a video on that coming soon.
Oh, good.
So,
I'm looking forward to that. Are you going to park a bunch of electric cars in the parking garage?
I think we might just go the structural engineer route, but we'll take that on advisement as the second version. So Forth now has operations up and down the West Coast, right?
And not just. So the other difference, I think in 2016 we had about 5 or 6 people on the team. We now are at about 42 people, and we're working on the West Coast, but also in St. Louis, in Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina. I'm probably forgetting a few, but yeah, we have projects all over the country. We have staff scattered all over the country. Lots of interesting things going on.
The other big change there's been several big changes, but one that has really interested me is the growth in the used electric vehicle market. Of course, back in 2015, the number of used electric vehicles was still pretty small because those first generation electric vehicles were 2, 3, 4 years old. Yep. But now we're seeing quite a robust development of used electric vehicles. How has that changed Forth's advocacy work and education work? Because you're now able to encourage people who would not be able to afford a brand new car to make that switch.
Yeah, I think it's really helped make that work more real. I mean, even in 2016, we were doing some of that work around used electric vehicles. We were doing some electric car share with used electric vehicles. but they're still very hard to find. And now it's a little bit easier if we're doing a ride and drive event, for example, to have some of those used electric vehicles there. The other thing we've seen that's been great is more attention to incentives for used electric vehicles. I mean, the idea that we have a national credit for used EVs was unthinkable 6 years ago. We were just trying to pass the Oregon rebate to include a used EV rebate, and having a lot of fights, even with some of our friends, about why that was important to do. So I think that's been a huge shift, and really excited to see more of those vehicles coming off lease, and see that continue.
I'm going to talk about some policy stuff a little later, but one thing I want to very briefly touch base on is that traditionally electric vehicles have been portrayed by the mass media, not by advocates per se. We've known this secret for years, but most mass media have portrayed EVs as being city vehicles, urbanite vehicles, suburban vehicles. And the number of times, even today, we hear from people who say, I live way out in the country, electric vehicles will not work for me.
Yeah.
Forth has spearheaded a very successful car share program in Hood River, east of here. And it's a very rural location. It's very popular with tourists. Tell me about that program, why Hood River, and what the feedback is thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another of those myths that's persistent and really frustrating, because the truth is people who live in rural areas have much more to gain from electric vehicles, right? I mean, when I lived in Northeast Portland, I had a 3-mile commute. It didn't make sense for me to have any car, much less an electric one. So yes, we've been running this car sharing project Cruise up in Hood River for about 3 years now. We also more recently have added car share vehicles at a bunch of rural electric utility locations around the state. And it's been a great way to expose folks in these communities to the technology, kind of let them dip a toe in the water. The Hood River project especially, part of what we're trying to do there is figure out, I mean, we have a bunch of projects going that are all targeted at trying to find a model for electric car share at affordable housing that is actually sustainable financially. It's a really tough business model. So in Hood River, what we were trying to test is having the vehicles available for folks who live in affordable housing at a certain rate, but also available to tourists at a higher rate, and also used by the local government up there at kind of an in-between rate, and see if we can make that model work by having that kind of tiered pricing and different levels of use. And then also just use that as a way to expose some other people to the technology and see what we learn from that.
And so far the feedback's been pretty positive, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has been. It is still challenging to figure out how to tweak all of that to make it work. But I think that project was also one of the first times we were able to have the car sharing app translated in Spanish, for example, some really basic access issues. So that's been exciting to see. And we're now working with the stakeholders up there to figure out how to sustain that service longer term and tie it into some other things they're doing, like shuttle service from Portland for tourists and things like that.
We are now starting to see a nationwide push, thanks to increased funding from the federal government. We've got the Infrastructure Act, which set aside a significant chunk of money for making sure that the electrical grid was up to standard for a modern age, promoting the use of renewable energy and sustainable methods of making sure that we can run our homes, whether that's through more efficient heating and cooling systems, whether that's installing home charging stations, whether that's installing public charging stations on highways. But we're also now, obviously, we've seen the Inflation Reduction Act, which again set aside a large chunk of change for EVs. How is that all working out for Forth, and what opportunities are opening up as a consequence of those two national investments that have been announced?
It is, I think a lot of us are feeling like the dog that caught the car, if I can put it that way. One of our team members coined this term opportunado for what's going on right now, because there are so many funding opportunities great problem to have. What we're seeing is communities are really a bit overwhelmed, and especially historically underserved communities, they don't have grant writers on staff. We're not necessarily prepared for this. So a lot of the work we're doing now is trying to help communities and community-based organizations figure out how to take advantage of all this funding, how to use it well, how to spend it quickly, how to spend it in ways that center equity. And that's a huge amount of work. It's hard for me to imagine it's only been a year, right, or so, that some of these things are starting to roll out. And we're still seeing a lot of these major funding programs just starting to come online. Somebody else here at the conference used the analogy of the roller coaster, and we're kind of going up and we're just at the top now, and we're kind of coming over the crest, and this is the point where everyone screams. And it's going to be wonderful, but right now there's also a moment of terror mixed in with that wonder.
Do you still think that the electric vehicle industry needs to safeguard against companies on the make, companies and organizations who are trying to grab some of that funding but aren't really invested in the future of whatever project they happen to be promoting?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing is just the explosion of interest in this space, and a lot of it is great. A lot of it is large, well-established companies in adjacent fields that are seeing the opportunity, and they have the resources to staff up and hire away all of my staff and figure out what they're doing and do it well. But then we're also seeing some opportunistic, some guy in a garage who says, sure, I can build fast chargers and install them for you. And, I think there's a lot of anxiety about, invariably there will be some stories where that kind of thing happens, right? And some of this influx of federal money is going to get spent poorly, and there's going to be scandals, and we need to be prepared to respond to that, because one little scandal is going to take 10 great success stories to outweigh it. It's what we saw in the last stimulus. Everyone still talks about Solyndra.
Right, exactly.
And for every Solyndra, there were 10 Teslas where the government got its money back and then some. So we definitely need to be prepared for that. We need to try and weed those folks out, and we need to be telling the story about all the good that this money is doing.
And to finish off, because I know you've got a million and one other things to do today, and this conference is just growing every year. You have seen a real explosion in micromobility solutions in the last 5 years. We've got some great, robust e-scooter sharing programs here in Portland, and across the Pacific Northwest. We're seeing electric bicycles become more and more affordable. We're seeing even electric unicycles. I know there's a group of electric unicyclists here in Portland who technically, while their vehicles are not legal, make great fun and do great things, promoting EVs in the process. What do you think that governments can do both at a local level and also at a national level to make it easier and more safe for people to forget about four-wheeled transportation and actually start at the roots of what we need, which is short, last-mile transportation solutions like micromobility?
Wow. We should do an hour conversation on that sometime. A couple of things. So one is, yes, it's really exciting to see these micromobility technologies, and especially e-bikes, finally catching on in the US. One of the first projects we did at Forth, back in 2011, 2012 when I started, was an electric bike demonstration project. And at that point in the US, they were not well known. Already in 2011, 2012, something like 40% of the bikes sold in Germany and the Netherlands were electric, but in the US it was, like 0.4%. So amazing to see that take off. I think I'm a hardcore cyclist. I'm the mammal, middle-aged man in Lycra. Most people are not. And if we want people to use bikes for transportation, e-bikes are going to be a huge part of that, right? It takes away the sweat, takes away a lot of the reasons and excuses people have not to ride a bike. We actually just did a report for the state of Oregon about what the state can do to advance electric micromobility. So a couple of highlights from that. One is we're really seeing that incentive programs work well. Denver's e-bike incentive that they're now trying to take statewide. Other communities have done this. It's a great way to get people to try this out. Would like to see more of those kinds of projects, really focusing frontline workers, historically underserved communities. We're doing some work with folks who are doing food delivery, for example, where that's a much, your take-home pay is much better if you're doing it in an electric bike than if you're doing it in a giant car. Another big chunk of it is the same thing that we need to do to make cycling in general more accessible, right? So more bike facilities, more investment in bike safety, bike lanes, all of those kinds of things. What I love about it is it's a virtuous circle. You get people on e-bikes who wouldn't have thought about riding a bike. It also increases the demands for safer facilities because mammals like me are also more comfortable riding in traffic, climbing big hills because the main route doesn't have a safe bike lane, doing all those things we need to do. The more we make this a mainstream mode of transportation, the more people will demand easier, safer alternatives. And the last thing I would say is just to emphasize that this is a both and. I think we often get caught up in these debates about, well, electric cars are still cars and cars cause all these problems. And that's true. And 90% plus of people still make 90% plus of trips in cars. So we have to make those environmental impacts as low as possible while we're also working towards a world where we have better options more of the time for doing what we need to do.
Jeff, thank you so much for spending a little longer than we'd planned, as is always the case. It's been great to catch up, and I know that Forth is going to be doing some incredible things this year. I cannot wait to see them all, and hopefully it will be a slightly shorter time before we next stand together in front of a camera and have a chat.
I was going to say, let's not wait this long.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
And thank you at home for watching. And of course, on that note, we are done with today's video. If you have comments, drop us a polite note in the Discord chat room in the comments below. You can reach out to us on Mastodon, or if you are a Patreon supporter, in the comments there. If you want more, subscribe, hit the bell, and follow the links to regularly support us with a YouTube membership or a Patreon subscription. You'll also find links to our Ko-fi, Bitcoin, and Swag store, as well as that aforementioned Mastodon server. Scrolling on my right is the list of amazing charged up supporters, and shout outs go out to our V2G Patreon supporters: Pedro Mora Pinheiro, Alan Topper, Andrew Martin, Bennett Elder, Brophy Wolf, Chris Maxwell, Cyprian Laplace, Dan Blair, Gordon C, Hay Esker, John Trammell, Kyle Fox, Mark Eggleton, Peter Dillinger, Regine Fellows, Sean Tucker, Stefan Fremgen, Stephen Williams, Tesla in the Gong, Paul Bricknell, Tony Moss, Carl Hodgson, Chris Centaur, Denny Hyde, Lars Shaw, Linda Irish, Mike Weeder, and Paul Nelson. And finally, thanks to our off-grid supporters: Paul Conway, Kevin Burrowbridge, Stephen O'Donoghue, Jim Burness, Robert Flannery, Aaron Hahn, Ellery Hensley, Rory Litwin, JP Fagerback, Dave Kitchen, Andrew Glenn, Anonymous Freak, Chris and Michael Johnson, Clay Witt, CPU Freak 101, Eric Knack, Joe Bresney, Joe Hughes, John Henderson, Laura Reynolds, Marcel Ward, Matthew Drobnak, Nigel S, Reggie Watts, Will Graylin, and of course, Ian. Don't forget that we make videos every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, as well as Saturday here on the main channel. Plus, if you like your gardening and chickens, head over to Take Two on Sunday for our chicken and garden update and our Sunday musing. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you soon, and as always, keep evolving.